The crystal goblets caught candlelight like captured stars as 12 members of the Morosini family raised their wine for the evening toast. Within minutes, they would all be convulsing on Persian rugs that cost more than most Venetians earned in a lifetime. This is the story of how one African servant girl brought Venice's most powerful merchant dynasty to its knees, with nothing more than patience, hemlock, and a silver ladle. Zara stood in the shadows of the Palazzo's great hall that humid August night in 1721, her dark hands folded over her simple servant's dress, watching the Morosini family settle into their feast. The ornate clock in the corner chimed 8 times, each note drifting across the Grand Canal like a funeral bell. The smell of roasted peacock mingled with jasmine floating through tall windows, while beneath it all lurked something else, the bitter, mousy scent of poison that no one at that glittering table could yet detect. Before we dive deeper into this dark chapter of Venetian history, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in the Venetian state archives for over 3 centuries. The Palazzo Morosini rose from the Grand Canal like a marble monument to merchant power, its Gothic windows reflecting the torch-lit gondolas that glided past in endless procession. Conte Alessandro Morosini ruled his trading empire with the same iron grip his ancestors had used to dominate spice routes from Constantinople to London. His wife, Elisabetta, managed their household of 23 servants with what she called Christian discipline, but others recognized as calculated cruelty. Zara had arrived in Venice 5 years earlier, chained in the hold of a slave ship from the Gold Coast. Purchased at the Rialto market like exotic spice, she'd been trained in the Palazzo's kitchens, learning to prepare the elaborate feasts that showcased Morosini wealth. Her quick mind absorbed not just recipes, but the intricate social choreography of Venetian nobility, who commanded respect, who harbored grudges, who held the real power behind painted smiles and silk gowns. The feast that night celebrated Alessandro's latest triumph, a monopoly contract for pepper imports that would make the family even richer. 12 family members had gathered in the Palazzo's grandest chamber, its frescoed ceiling depicting mythological scenes of abundance and power. None of them noticed how Zara's eyes tracked every movement from her position by the kitchen door, or how her scarred hands, marked by years of burns from touching pots she'd been forbidden to move slowly enough, remained perfectly steady as she served course after course. "Pass the wine, would you?" Elisabetta asked her eldest son, not seeing how Zara's gaze lingered on each glass, each plate, each mouth that would soon be frothing with the foam of hemlock poisoning. The preparation had taken months of careful planning. Venice's apothecary sold the deadly plant extract as medicine for nervous conditions, and a servant purchasing it for her mistress raised no suspicion. But this wasn't just about poison. This was about power, carefully redistributed 1 drop at a time. From the diary of Fra Benedetto, confessor to the Morosini family, dated August 15, 1721, the girl Zara grows troublesome. The Contessa complains she moves too slowly, looks too boldly, speaks when not spoken to. I fear the African blood runs hot with rebellion. The youngest family member, 8-year-old Caterina, pushed her vegetables around her silver plate. "These taste strange, Nonna," she complained to her grandmother. Elisabetta's mother, the ancient Donna Lucrezia, waved a jeweled hand dismissively. "Nonsense, child. Zara's cooking is above reproach." The horrible irony of it: praise served with poison, trust seasoned with betrayal. What drives someone to cross the line from servitude to murder? Was it the daily humiliations, the casual cruelties, or something deeper, the systematic destruction of human dignity that Venice's merchant princes practiced as casually as they counted ducats? The Morosini family continued their celebration, discussing silk prices and upcoming carnival masquerades, while their fate crystallized in their bloodstreams with each swallow. Count Alessandro raised his goblet for another toast, his third of the evening, to family. He declared, his voice already beginning to slur, though he attributed it to fine Chianti, to prosperity, and to the natural order that places each soul in their rightful station. Zara's fingers tightened on the doorframe as those words echoed across centuries of justification for the unjustifiable. By 8:30 that evening, young Caterina had begun to vomit onto the Flemish tablecloth. Her mother, Donna Isabella, rushed to her side, but found her own vision blurring, her legs betraying her with each step. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic revenge, calculated with the precision of a master alchemist who happened to wear servant's rags. The dining hall erupted into confusion as, one by one, the Morosini family began to experience the Hemlock's cruel progression. Count Alessandro tried to stand, his face flushing crimson, hands clawing at his throat. The plant's alkaloids worked methodically, shutting down nervous systems in a sequence Zara had studied by observing the palazzo's cats when they caught poisoned rats meant for the granaries. She noted the timing, adjusted her calculations, perfected her dosages through months of careful observation. But here's what the Venetian authorities never understood. Zara hadn't learned about poisons in some exotic African ritual or mysterious voodoo ceremony, as they would later claim. She learned from the Morosini family's own physician, Dr. Marcantonio Bragadin, during his evening visits to treat the Count's gout. From the medical records of Dr. Marcantonio Bragadin, archived August 17, 1721, patient exhibits symptoms consistent with nervous poisoning, conium maculatum suspected. Quantity suggests deliberate administration. God preserve us all. While pretending to dust the study's leather-bound medical texts, Zara had memorized every word about plant alkaloids, absorption rates, and lethal dosages. She'd studied the human anatomy charts hanging on Bragadin's walls, learning which organs failed first, which symptoms appeared when. This wasn't impulse, this was education turned weapon. The other servants heard the screams echoing through the palazzo's marble halls, but their response revealed the deeper horror of that night. Marco, the head butler who'd served the family for 15 years, stood frozen in the kitchen. He could have run to fetch Dr. Bragadin, whose residence lay just 3 bridges away in San Polo. Instead, he slowly, deliberately, finished polishing the silver serving spoons. Death was being served on silver. "Fetch the physician," Isabella gasped, foam gathering at the corners of her mouth as she crawled toward the ornate bell pull that would summon help. But Lucia, the housemaid closest to the rope, suddenly developed an urgent need to check the wine cellar. And Giuseppe, the footman, discovered that the palazzo's front doors required immediate attention that involved walking as slowly as humanly possible. What would you have done, watching your tormentors suffer? Would you have helped, or would you have found excuses to look the other way? The Morosini Palazzo had witnessed 5 years of systematic cruelty toward Zara that went far beyond typical servant treatment. Elisabetta's Christian discipline included forcing Zara to work with burns that festered for weeks, denying her medical attention that was routinely provided to the palazzo's hunting dogs. Alessandro's idea of instruction involved striking her with his walking stick when she moved too slowly, leaving purple welts that servants weren't permitted to acknowledge or treat. But the final catalyst had come just 3 days earlier, when Elisabetta discovered that Zara could read. Not just Italian, but Latin skills she'd acquired by secretly studying the family's discarded prayer books by candlelight. Instead of marveling at this intelligence, Elisabetta had flown into a rage that such knowledge existed in African hands. The punishment, 20 lashes in the palazzo's courtyard, administered while other servants were forced to watch. An educated slave is a dangerous slave, Elisabetta had declared, the whip cutting through summer air thick with jasmine and screams. That night, as Zara tended her wounds alone in the servants' quarters, she made her final calculations. not just about poison, but about power, justice, and the mathematics of revenge. She'd identified the perfect opportunity, Alessandro's celebration feast, when the entire family would gather, when their guard would be lowest, when their wine would flow strongest. The Hemlock had come from the apothecary shop of Master Tommaso near the Rialto Bridge, purchased over several weeks in small quantities. For Donna Elisabetta's nerves, Zara had explained each time, speaking the practiced lies that slavery had taught her to perfect. The dried leaves were ground fine and mixed with wine reduction, stirred into cream sauces, even dusted like exotic spice over the peacock that served as the evening's centerpiece. Every dish that touched their lips carried death in its seasoning. By 9 o'clock, half the family had lost consciousness. Count Alessandro used his final moments of clarity to scrawl something on a napkin with shaking hands. The African did this, as if anyone would need confirmation, but Alessandro never got to finish that accusation, because by 9:15, his nervous system had surrendered to the plant's relentless chemistry. The great hall fell silent, except for labored breathing and the distant sound of gondoliers singing on the canal below, life continuing its rhythm, while death worked its transformation inside marble walls. And in that terrible quiet, as the Morosini dynasty breathed its last, Zara was already moving through the palazzo's hidden passages, preparing for the most dangerous part of her plan, escape through a city where every face would soon be hunting hers. The splash of oars against black water echoed through narrow canals as Zara slipped from the palazzo's water gate into a stolen gondola. Behind her, the screams had finally stopped, replaced by the more terrifying sound of absolute silence. This wasn't just escape. This was the most audacious vanishing act in Venetian history, executed by someone the authorities considered barely human. The Rio San Trovaso carried the scent of low tide and secrets, its waters reflecting torch flames that danced like trapped souls against stone walls. Zara's hands, steady enough to measure poison by the grain, now trembled against the gondola's worn wood as she navigated channels she'd memorized during 5 years of marketing errands. Each bridge loomed like a gallows, each turning a potential trap, but she moved with the practiced silence of someone who'd learned invisibility as survival. Venice at night belonged to different creatures than those who ruled by day. Courtesans glided between assignments in silk-lined gondolas, their laughter masking harder transactions. Smugglers moved contraband through canals that customs officers couldn't patrol, their boats riding low with hidden cargo. And tonight, a servant girl joined their ranks, carrying the deadliest contraband of all knowledge of what 12 corpses lying in a marble palace would mean for the city's power structure. The Morosini banking house controlled more than spice routes. Their ledgers held debts from half the noble families in Venice, loans that had funded everything from carnival pageants to military expeditions against the Ottomans. With the family extinct, those debts would scatter like ashes in the wind, reshaping the economic landscape in ways no one could predict. But Zara wasn't thinking about economics as she guided the gondola through the maze of waterways. She was thinking about survival and the carefully cached supplies she'd hidden over months of preparation. 3 days earlier, while nursing the welts from Elisabetta's whipping, she'd finalized her escape route. The servant who'd been beaten for learning to read had also learned to plan with military precision. In a wine barrel at the abandoned Fondaco dei Turchi, she'd stored men's clothing, forged travel papers, and 200 ducats stolen coin by coin from the Morosini household accounts over 2 years. Money they'd never miss, accumulated through the simple expedient of being invisible while they counted their wealth. The forged papers identified her as Malik ibn Zakaria, a Moorish merchant traveling to Padua on textile business. The disguise wasn't perfect, but Venice's cosmopolitan character meant that foreign faces moved through the city daily. More importantly, the The papers bore the seal of Master Giuseppe Caldiera, the notary who'd authenticated them without knowing their true purpose. One of many small corruptions that kept Venice's bureaucracy functioning. From the interrogation records of the Council of Ten, dated August 20th, 1721, witness Marco Benedetti, head butler. She moved like smoke, excellencies. One moment tending the dying, the next simply gone, as if the shadows had swallowed her whole. The gondola scraped against stone as Zara reached her first checkpoint, the Chiesa di San Giacomo del Orio, where Father Anselmo had been conducting secret masses for Venice's hidden community of former slaves and converted Muslims. The priest had never questioned why a servant girl occasionally appeared in his confessional speaking Arabic prayers, or why she sometimes left small donations that bore no resemblance to a servant's wages. Now, she slipped into the church through its side entrance, her feet silent on stones worn smooth by centuries of desperate petitioners. The nave smelled of incense and despair, while moonlight filtered through stained glass, casting colored shadows that danced like fragments of broken souls. Father Anselmo waited in the shadows, his weathered face grave with understanding. "Child, what have you done? What needed doing?" Zara's voice carried no tremor now, no uncertainty. "What they forced me to do." She changed clothes behind the altar while the priest kept watch, transforming from servant girl to Moorish merchant, with movements practiced in the palazzo's hidden corners. The male clothing fit perfectly. She'd measured and tailored each piece during stolen hours, using skills learned from the palazzo's seamstresses before they'd been forbidden to teach her anything beyond basic mending. But clothing was only part of the transformation. Zara bound her breasts with linen strips, darkened her skin with walnut stain, and practiced the deeper voice she'd cultivated by imitating the Moorish traders who visited the Rialto markets. Every detail had been rehearsed until it became second nature. "The authorities will search everywhere," Father Anselmo warned, pressing a small silver cross into her palm. "They'll question everyone who might have helped you." "Then you know nothing of me," Zara replied, her voice already different, rougher, carrying the authority she'd been denied her entire life. "I was never here." Venice had taught her many things: how to prepare elaborate feasts, how to read Latin texts, how to move through marble halls without making sound. But most importantly, it had taught her how to become invisible by playing the roles others expected to see. The priest would survive the coming investigation by telling simple truths wrapped in calculated ignorance. The servant girl Zara had vanished. A Moorish merchant had sought blessing for his travels. These were separate events, unconnected by anything more than coincidence and the mercy of God. As bells chimed 11 across the sleeping city, Zara stepped back into the night transformed. Not running now, but walking with the measured pace of a man conducting legitimate business. The stolen gondola had been abandoned, replaced by passage on a cargo barge whose captain asked no questions beyond the weight of her silver. But dawn would bring discovery of the bodies, and with it, the largest manhunt in Venice's history. The screams of Donna Margherita, the palazzo's head cook, pierced the morning air like a seagull's cry as she discovered 12 corpses arranged around the dining table like a macabre still life. Flies had already claimed the feast, buzzing over cold peacock and congealed wine in a symphony of decay. This wasn't just murder. This was the complete annihilation of Venice's third most powerful banking dynasty, executed in a single night by someone the city had barely bothered to consider human. The morning bells of San Marco echoed across water that sparkled with deceptive innocence while gondoliers ferried their first passengers of the day, oblivious to the carnage that would soon reshape their world. Inside the Palazzo Morosini, Margherita's discovery sent shockwaves through the household as servants gathered in the doorway, their faces displaying emotions carefully calibrated between horror and something else, something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. By 7 that morning, word had reached the Doge's palace. The Council of Ten Venice's secret tribunal that handled matters of state security dispatched their most experienced investigator, Capitano Lorenzo Grimani, a man whose reputation for extracting confessions was legendary throughout the Mediterranean. His pale eyes had witnessed every form of human cruelty the Republic could devise, but even he paused at the threshold of the dining hall. "Mother of God," he whispered, making the sign of the cross. What manner of devil could orchestrate this? The devil, at that moment, was paying passage on a grain barge 40 miles up the Brenta River. Disguised as the Moorish merchant Malik ibn Zakaria, Zara had spent the night moving through Venice's network of commercial waterways, following routes she'd memorized by listening to conversations at the Rialto markets. Every mile put distance between her and the investigation she knew would consume the city like wildfire. From the official report of Capitano Lorenzo Grimani, dated August 22, 1721, preliminary examination suggests systematic poisoning using plant alkaloids. The precision required indicates medical knowledge far exceeding that expected of household staff. Suspect's whereabouts unknown. But Grimani's investigation faced an immediate problem. The surviving servants' testimonies contained gaps large enough to hide entire conspiracies. Marco, the head butler, claimed Zara had disappeared during the evening's chaos. He'd last seen her serving the wine course around 8:30. The other servants corroborated this timeline with suspicious precision, their stories aligning too perfectly to be entirely truthful. What they didn't reveal was the meeting held in the servants' quarters at 3 that morning, after the screaming had stopped. 23 people had gathered in the cramped space beneath the palazzo's kitchen, their faces illuminated by single candle that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. They'd made a collective decision that would protect them all. Zara had vanished like smoke, and none of them had seen which direction the smoke had blown. The household had closed ranks with military precision. Not out of love for Zara, many had barely spoken to her during her 5 years of service, but out of shared understanding that her fate could easily become theirs. Venice's justice system had little patience for distinguishing between accomplice and bystander when noble blood had been spilled. But Grimani was no fool. He'd survived 20 years of political intrigue by reading the spaces between words, the glances between lies. He ordered the palazzo sealed and began systematic interrogation of every servant, starting with those closest to the kitchen. "Tell me about the girl," he commanded Lucia, the housemaid whose duties had included cleaning Zara's quarters. Her habits, her friends, her capabilities. Lucia's weathered hands twisted her apron as she spoke carefully measured truths. She kept to herself, Capitano, worked hard, never complained, even when. She trailed off, her eyes finding fascinating details in the floor's marble patterns. Even when what? Even when the punishment was harsh. She bore it all in silence, like she was storing it somewhere deep inside. Grimani made notes in his leather-bound journal, his practiced eye catching the things Lucia didn't say. The way she avoided mentioning Zara's intelligence, her uncanny ability to anticipate the family's needs, her habit of lingering near doorways when important conversations took place. Most tellingly, Lucia failed to mention the books she'd seen hidden beneath Zara's mattress, medical texts stolen from Dr. Bragadin's study, and copied by hand during stolen midnight hours. Venice had been turned inside out. While Grimani interrogated servants, other investigators combed the city's apothecaries, tracking purchases of suspicious substances. Master Tommaso's shop near the Rialto revealed damning evidence. Multiple purchases of dried hemlock over the past month, always by a young African woman claiming to serve Donna Elisabetta's nervous condition. She spoke perfect Italian, Tommaso testified, his hands shaking as he recalled the transactions. Better than perfect. She used medical terms. I barely understood myself. Asked questions about dosages, about absorption rates. I thought she was simply following her mistress's instructions. The manhunt expanded beyond Venice's borders as dawn revealed the scope of the catastrophe. 12 members of the Morosini family dead, their banking empire in chaos, debts and credits scattered like leaves in an autumn wind. Half the noble families in Venice faced immediate financial crisis as the Morosini ledgers revealed the true extent of their obligations. But 50 miles away, Zara had already shed another skin. The Moorish merchant Malik had disembarked at Padua, where papers identified him as a textile trader bound for Milan. The transformation required more than clothing. She'd practiced male mannerisms for months, studying how men occupied space differently, how they gestured with casual authority denied to women, especially enslaved women. The manhunt's first breakthrough came at noon, when a gondolier reported seeing a young African woman near San Giacomo dell'Orio around midnight. Father Anselmo, summoned for questioning, admitted that someone matching Zara's description had sought spiritual guidance that evening, though he claimed clerical privilege prevented him from revealing details of their conversation. Grimani's eyes narrowed. Spiritual guidance, Father? Or assistance with earthly escape? But even under pressure, the priest held firm to his carefully constructed truth. He'd given blessing to a troubled soul seeking redemption. What sins required such redemption remained between the penitent and God. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Grand Canal, Grimani realized he was hunting something more dangerous than a simple servant who'd snapped under cruelty. The evidence pointed to months of careful planning, sophisticated knowledge of poisons, and a network of accomplices who'd helped orchestrate the perfect vanishing act. Venice's greatest nightmare had come to pass. The invisible had become visible, and in doing so, had made the powerful mortal. By noon on August 23rd, every church bell in Venice tolled a funeral dirge that could be heard from Murano to the Lido. The sound rolled across the lagoon like thunder, announcing that the impossible had happened. A servant had murdered her masters and vanished into thin air. This wasn't just about 12 corpses. This was about the fundamental order of Venetian society, cracking like poorly mixed glass in the furnaces of Murano. The Doge's emergency session convened in the golden splendor of the Palazzo Ducale, where portraits of ancient rulers stared down with painted disapproval at the crisis unfolding beneath their gilded frames. The air hung thick with incense and indignation as Venice's most powerful men grappled with a truth that threatened everything they believed about their carefully constructed world. Senator Alvise Pisani, whose own household employed 15 servants, paced the marble floors with barely contained panic. If one African girl can eliminate an entire noble family, he declared to the assembled council, what prevents every kitchen maid, every stable boy, every invisible pair of hands from following her example? The question echoed through chambers where the Republic's secret business had been conducted for centuries, chambers that suddenly felt less secure than they had the day before. Outside, the city that had once conquered empires and dominated trade routes from London to Constantinople found itself paralyzed by fear of its own household staff. Meanwhile, 100 miles north in Milan, Zara had undergone her third transformation in as many days. The Moorish merchant Malik ibn Zakaria had purchased passage on a merchant caravan bound for the Alpine passes. But the woman who now walked among pack mules and trading goods bore little resemblance to either the servant girl who'd fled Venice or the merchant who'd crossed the Veneto plains. From the travel records of the Milano Customs House, dated August 24th, 1721, 1. Tommaso Benedetti, spice merchant of Genoa, declared 300 weight of pepper and sundry aromatics, papers in order, duties paid in full. Zara had become Tommaso through another careful metamorphosis that demonstrated the systematic intelligence Venice's authorities had fatally underestimated. The transformation required more than clothing and documents. She'd studied the mannerisms of Genoese traders during their visits to the Rialto markets, absorbing their distinctive accent, their gesture patterns, their casual arrogance born of maritime supremacy. But her most brilliant disguise element came from understanding how people really saw each other. Tommaso wore the slightly poxed complexion that marked a man who'd survived childhood diseases, achieved through careful application of walnut stain and rice powder. More importantly, he carried himself with the weary confidence of someone who'd spent decades moving valuable cargo through dangerous territories, exactly the kind of man customs officials processed without memorable scrutiny. The merchant caravan wound through alpine passes where the air smelled of pine resin and snow, while eagle cries echoed off granite walls that had witnessed centuries of traders fleeing various forms of justice. Zara rode among them with perfect anonymity, just another face in the constant flow of commerce that connected Venice to the German states. Yet even as she climbed toward freedom, the Republic's vengeance was gathering momentum behind her like an avalanche. Capitano Grimani had made a breakthrough that changed everything about the investigation's scope and urgency. Hidden behind a loose stone in Zara's former quarters, investigators had discovered something that transformed her from escaped servant to existential threat. A detailed journal written in a mixture of Italian, Latin, and Arabic scripts that revealed the true extent of her activities over 5 years of apparent submission. The journal contained more than poison recipes and escape plans. It held careful observations of Venice's noble families, their financial dealings, their personal weaknesses, their secret sins recorded with the precision of a natural philosopher studying insects. Zara had been conducting intelligence gathering that would have impressed the Republic's own spies, cataloging information that could destabilize the entire aristocratic structure. Most chilling were the names listed in careful columns, each accompanied by detailed notes about household routines, family gatherings, and access to food preparation. The Morosini family had been neither her first target nor intended to be her last. Venice burned with paranoid fire. Senator Pisani's worst fears were materializing as the journal's contents leaked through the noble community like poison through bloodstreams. Every great family discovered their names in Zara's careful script, their private business recorded by someone they'd considered barely human. The Grimani household dismissed their entire kitchen staff. The Dandolo family locked their servants in quarters at night. The Barbaro clan hired food tasters for every meal. She turned our own knowledge against us, Dr. Bragadin admitted during his interrogation, his medical expertise having provided the foundation for Zara's poison preparation. Every conversation she overheard, every book she glimpsed, every casual remark about human anatomy, she absorbed it all, while we saw nothing but obedient service. But the journal revealed something even more dangerous than planned murders: evidence of a network, names and locations suggesting other servants, other households, other individuals who'd been sharing information and resources. What had appeared to be the isolated act of a single desperate woman now looked like the opening move in a coordinated uprising. The manhunt expanded beyond Italy's borders. Riders carried Zara's description and the promise of massive rewards through the German states, into France, across the dangerous mountain passes where smugglers and refugees traditionally disappeared. Venice had never mounted such an extensive search for a single individual who wasn't royal or politically connected. Yet their quarry had anticipated this response with calculating precision. While investigators combed through her journal and authorities dispatched hunters across Europe, Zara was implementing the most audacious phase of her escape plan, hiding in plain sight among the very people searching for her. The merchant caravan she'd joined included 2 Venetian agents traveling under commercial cover, tasked with questioning traders about suspicious individuals matching her description. They shared campfires with Tommaso Benedetti for 3 nights, discussing the manhunt that had consumed their city while never recognizing that their quarry was measuring out their evening wine portions with the same careful attention she'd once given to hemlock dosages. On the 4th night, as the caravan approached the Swiss border, Zara made her final transformation, one that would take her beyond the reach of Venetian justice and into legend. The merchant caravan crested the final ridge before the Swiss border as dawn broke over peaks that gleamed like silver daggers against a blood-red sky. Below them stretched the village of Chiavenna, its smoke rising straight up in the windless air like prayers seeking heaven. This wasn't just another border crossing. This was the threshold between Venetian reach and absolute freedom, where the Republic's authority died among granite walls that had sheltered fugitives for centuries. The descent into Swiss territory took 3 hours of careful navigation along paths carved by generations of smugglers and refugees. The air grew thinner, colder, carrying the scent of pine sap and glacier melt that spoke of distances Venice could never bridge. Zara, still disguised as the Genoese spice merchant Tommaso Benedetti, felt each mile like a chain breaking, though she maintained the weary posture of someone who'd made this journey countless times. But freedom's proximity brought unexpected dangers. At the customs house that straddled the border like a stone spider, Swiss guards conducted more thorough inspections than their Italian counterparts. These men had seen every form of contraband, every type of fugitive, every variety of forged document that desperate people could devise. Their captain, Hauptmann Klaus Zimmermann, possessed the gray eyes of someone who'd learned to read guilt in posture, in breathing patterns, in the microscopic hesitations that separated truth from performance. Spices from Genoa, Zimmermann observed in accented Italian, examining Tommaso's carefully prepared papers. Expensive cargo for such dangerous roads. Zara had anticipated this moment through months of preparation, understanding that her greatest test wouldn't come from Venetian investigators, but from neutral authorities who had no stake in the Republic's internal chaos. Swiss guards cared nothing for noble blood or servant rebellion. They cared only about order, documentation, and the fees that kept their mountain passes profitable. Expensive, yes, she replied in Tommaso's practiced accent, letting exhaustion color her voice. But the German markets pay premium prices for genuine Ligurian saffron, worth the risk if one has the stomach for mountain travel. From the interrogation records of Swiss border authorities, dated August 27, 1721, Merchant Benedetti presented acceptable documentation. Cargo manifest matched physical inventory. No cause for detention identified. What the records didn't capture was Zimmermann's lingering unease, the instinct that had kept him alive through 20 years of border duty. Something about the merchant's hands troubled him, too soft for someone who supposedly handled cargo regularly, too steady for someone making their first alpine crossing. But instinct without evidence remained merely suspicion, and suspicion didn't justify delaying legitimate commerce. The caravan proceeded into Switzerland, climbing higher into valleys where Italian gave way to German, where Catholic bells yielded to Protestant simplicity, where the very architecture spoke of different loyalties and different laws. For the first time since fleeing Venice, Zara allowed herself to believe in survival. Not just escape, but the possibility of building something new from the ashes of everything she destroyed. But Venice's reach extended farther than mountain borders. In the village inn where the caravan stopped for supplies, a travel-stained messenger waited with orders that would test every aspect of Zara's carefully constructed identity. Cardinal Alessandro Albani, Venice's most influential diplomatic figure, had negotiated an extraordinary agreement with Swiss authorities. In exchange for significant trade concessions, the cantons would assist in apprehending the Morosini poisoner. Wanted notices bearing her description were being posted in every inn, church, and market square throughout the German-speaking territories. The net was closing with mathematical precision. "They say she's a demon," the innkeeper's wife whispered to Tommaso as she served his evening meal, her voice carrying the superstitious dread that had begun attaching itself to Zara's story. "Learned her poison arts from African witchcraft, then used them to slaughter Christian folk like sheep." Zara chewed her bread with careful calm while listening to her own transformation into legend. Venice's official version painted her as something supernatural, removing any suggestion that ordinary servants might possess the intelligence or capability for systematic revenge. Better to blame African mysticism than admit that 5 years of casual cruelty had created a monster from materials they themselves had provided. But legends, she realized, could provide their own form of protection. People feared demons differently than they hunted criminals. They looked for signs of otherworldly power, supernatural abilities, exotic rituals, all of which made them less likely to notice the careful intelligence and systematic planning that had actually enabled her success. That night, Zara implemented her most audacious transformation yet. Using supplies cached months earlier with a network of contacts that extended deeper into European underground commerce than Venice had imagined possible, she began the process of becoming someone entirely new. Not another male merchant, but something far more unexpected. A nun, Sister Benedetta of the Franciscan order, traveling from a convent in Padua to take up mission work among German-speaking Catholics, represented perfect invisibility. Religious women moved through European society with special protections, immune from the casual searches that affected ordinary travelers. More importantly, they were assumed to possess neither the knowledge nor the temperament for sophisticated violence. The transformation required more than brown robes and wooden crosses. Zara had spent months studying the mannerisms of religious women who'd visited the Morosini Palazzo, absorbing their speech patterns, their deferential gestures, their way of occupying space without claiming it. She could recite Latin prayers learned from stolen prayer books, discuss theological matters with educated clergy, and project the particular combination of humility and quiet authority that marked genuine religious dedication. As dawn approached over the Swiss mountains, Sister Benedetta prepared to join a group of German pilgrims heading toward the monastery of Street Gallon. Behind her, the spice merchant Tommaso Benedetti had vanished as completely as the servant girl Zara, leaving only carefully scattered clues suggesting he'd been killed by bandits while attempting to cross a particularly treacherous mountain pass. But in Venice, Capitano Grimani had made a discovery that would change everything about the manhunt's direction and intensity. Evidence that Zara hadn't acted alone, and that her network of accomplices included individuals far more dangerous than anyone had imagined possible. Sister Benedetta knelt in the morning shadows of Street Gallon's ancient monastery, her lips moving in silent prayer, while her mind calculated distances, timing, and the probability that Venetian gold had already purchased Swiss cooperation. The Gothic arches above her head had sheltered fugitives for 8 centuries, but even stone walls couldn't guarantee sanctuary against the Republic's expanding rage. This wasn't just about one escaped servant anymore. This was about dismantling a conspiracy that threatened to topple the foundations of European aristocratic power. The monastery bells chimed prime as Brother Heinrich, the German priest who'd welcomed the traveling nun, approached with troubling news written across his weathered features. His morning prayers had been interrupted by riders bearing the Venetian lion on their surcoats, men who spoke of massive rewards and asked pointed questions about recent arrivals from Italian territories. "Sister, I fear your journey must continue sooner than planned," he whispered in Latin, his voice echoing off stones that had absorbed centuries of similar warnings. "The authorities seek someone of your particular background." Zara's pulse quickened, but Sister Benedetta's expression remained serene, beatific even. She'd practiced this mask until it became second nature, understanding that survival often required becoming the lie so completely that even trained observers saw only what they expected to see. 100 miles south in Venice, Capitano Grimani had uncovered evidence that transformed the Morosini murders from isolated revenge into something far more terrifying: the opening move in a coordinated campaign against the Republic's ruling class. Hidden in the Palazzo's wine cellar, behind barrels of Chianti that had aged longer than Zara had lived, investigators had discovered a cache of documents that revealed the true scope of her network. The papers contained correspondence with servants in 6 other noble households, detailed floor plans of their palazzos, and most damning of all, a list of dates marking planned celebrations that extended through the spring of 1722. The Morosini feast had been merely the beginning. From the private journal of Capitano Lorenzo Grimani, dated August 29, 1721, we face not a single murderer, but a revolution conducted through wine cups and serving spoons. God preserve the Republic, for we have nurtured vipers in our very kitchens. The network's sophistication exceeded anything Venetian authorities had encountered in decades of crushing political conspiracies. Each servant had been assigned specific intelligence-gathering duties, monitoring family schedules, identifying vulnerabilities, mapping escape routes. They'd communicated through a system of coded messages hidden in market transactions, creating an invisible web of information that had operated beneath noble notice for years. But the most chilling discovery lay in the network's recruitment methods. Zara hadn't simply convinced other servants to join her, cause she'd systematically identified individuals whose suffering had reached breaking points, then provided them with education disguised as friendship. Reading lessons that doubled as poison preparation, medical knowledge shared during late-night conversations, escape planning presented as hypothetical discussions about freedom. She'd been teaching revolution while her masters slept. The revelations sent shockwaves through Venice that rippled across European diplomatic networks like seismic tremors. If servants could organize sophisticated campaigns against their owners, if the invisible could become visible and deadly, then no household anywhere could consider itself secure. The Spanish court dismissed their entire staff. French nobles began employing armed guards during meals. German princes instituted loyalty oaths that carried death penalties for violation. Meanwhile, Sister Benedetta had joined a pilgrimage group traveling north toward the Rhine territories, her brown robes blending perfectly among 24 genuine religious women whose piety provided perfect camouflage. The pilgrims moved with the slow determination of those seeking spiritual rather than worldly goals, their pace calculated to avoid attracting attention from authorities more concerned with rapid movements and suspicious haste. But Zara's greatest protection came from understanding how people really saw religious women. The pilgrims were questioned 3 times at various checkpoints, but the inquiries focused on their male escorts, their cargo, their destinations. The women themselves were barely examined, treated as spiritual cargo, requiring protection rather than potential threats requiring investigation. The cruelest irony was written in ash. At each stop, Sister Benedetta heard herself described in increasingly supernatural terms. The stories had evolved beyond simple murder into elaborate tales of demonic possession, witchcraft, and unholy alliances with forces that proper Christians dared not name. Venice's propaganda machine had transformed her into something so otherworldly that searchers looked past the obviously human woman kneeling beside them in prayer. Yet even legends couldn't entirely shield her from the manhunt's expanding scope. At a riverside inn near Strasbourg, she overheard conversations that made her blood freeze in her veins. Venetian agents had traced her escape route with disturbing accuracy, following the trail of discarded identities like bloodhounds following scent. They'd found evidence of Malik the Moorish merchant, discovered traces of Tommaso the spice trader, and were closing the gaps in her timeline with mathematical precision. They say she transforms herself like smoke taking new shapes, one agent told his companion over evening wine, unaware that their quarry sat 3 tables away sharing bread with German nuns. But smoke leaves traces in the air. We'll find those traces. The network's other members weren't proving as elusive as their inspiration. In Venice, interrogations had begun yielding names, locations, and details about planned attacks that painted a picture of coordinated rebellion extending far beyond Italian borders. The servant girl who taught others to read had also taught them to think systemically about power, oppression, and the mathematical possibilities of revenge. Arrests were made in Milan, Florence, even distant Naples. Each captured conspirator revealed new connections, new households compromised, new evidence that the invisible workforce maintaining aristocratic comfort had been planning its own version of justice. The Republic's investigation expanded into the largest manhunt in European history, consuming resources and attention that would have impressed a military campaign. But as autumn deepened across the German territories and Sister Benedetta's pilgrimage approached its final destination, Zara began implementing the most audacious phase of her plan. Not just escape, but disappearance so complete that even legends would fade into historical footnote. The convent of Sainte-Odile, perched like an eagle's nest on an Alsatian mountain, had sheltered women seeking refuge from the world's cruelties for 4 centuries. Its walls contained secrets that predated Venice itself, and its abbess, Mère Augustine, possessed the gray wisdom of someone who'd learned to distinguish between genuine sanctuary seekers and dangerous pretenders. Tomorrow, Sister Benedetta would knock on those ancient gates and request admission to a community where names, histories, and past sins could be buried beneath layers of prayer and penance, where even Venetian gold couldn't penetrate walls sanctified by centuries of absolute silence. But tonight, in a roadside inn, where the Rhine's waters reflected stars like scattered diamonds, she made one final entry in a journal that would never be found, never be read, never provide evidence for the hunter still following her fading trail across half of Europe. The iron gates of St. Odile Convent groaned open like the jaws of eternity as Sister Benedetta crossed the threshold into a world where even Venice's longest reach could never penetrate. Behind her, the autumn mist swirled across Alsatian peaks, carrying with it the last traces of a woman who had murdered 12 people and vanished into history. This wasn't just sanctuary. This was the final transformation that would erase Zara from existence more completely than death itself ever could. The convent's stone corridors smelled of centuries of beeswax, incense, and secrets too dangerous for the outside world to contain. Mère Augustine, the abbess whose silver hair had witnessed 7 decades of women seeking refuge from unspeakable pasts, studied the latest arrival with eyes that had learned to distinguish between genuine penitence and calculated performance. The woman who knelt before her possessed the perfect humility of someone who'd practiced surrender as survival, but beneath that carefully constructed deference lay something else, a stillness, too complete to be entirely natural. "Sister, what sins bring you to our walls?" the abbess asked in Latin, her voice echoing off stones that had absorbed similar confessions for 400 years. "Pride," Zara replied, choosing truth wrapped in acceptable packaging. "The pride that leads one to believe they can dispense justice when God has not granted them that authority." The answer satisfied ecclesiastical requirements, while revealing nothing that could endanger either speaker. Mère Augustine had heard every variation of human transgression, from adultery to treason, but she'd learned that some knowledge was better left unexamined. The convent existed to provide redemption, not to conduct inquiries that might threaten the peace of souls seeking genuine sanctuary. Within days, Sister Benedetta had disappeared even more completely than her previous identities. The convent's rule of silence meant that conversations occurred only during designated hours, and then only about matters essential for daily survival. Names became irrelevant when identity dissolved into collective prayer. Individual history subsumed beneath the rhythm of communal worship that began before dawn and ended after the final star appeared. But silence couldn't entirely erase the outside world's determination to find her. 3 weeks after her arrival, Venetian agents appeared at the convent's gates, bearing papal documents that demanded cooperation in locating a fugitive who'd murdered Christian nobility. The letters carried seals impressive enough to command attention from any normal religious community. St. Odile, however, had never been normal. From the archives of St. Odile Convent, dated October 15, 1721, no woman matching the described fugitive has sought sanctuary within these walls. Our community remains devoted to prayer, penance, and the preservation of souls too damaged for worldly redemption. The response was technically accurate. since no one at the convent knew Sister Benedetta's true identity, and the woman they harbored bore no resemblance to the demon Venice's propaganda had created. Mère Augustine had perfected the art of protective ignorance over decades of sheltering inconvenient truths from inconvenient authorities. The agents departed unsatisfied, but legally stymied. Ecclesiastical sanctuary carried protections that even the Republic's diplomatic influence couldn't overcome, without risking conflicts that would consume more resources than any single fugitive justified. They left behind generous donations and promises of future rewards, but the convent's gates remained closed to temporal concerns. Winter settled over the Alsatian mountains like a blessing disguised as hardship, cutting the convent off from outside contact for months at a time. The isolation that might have driven other women to despair became Zara's final protection, allowing her to disappear so completely that even she began to forget the woman she'd been before. Brown robes replaced servant's dress. The daily routine of prayer, work, and meditation transformed her with an efficiency that surprised even someone who'd mastered the art of becoming other people. Her hands, once steady enough to measure poison by the grain, now moved with equal precision through illuminated manuscript copying, her knowledge of Latin proving useful for preserving religious texts that might otherwise crumble with age. But transformation works in both directions. While Zara disappeared into Sister Benedetta's increasingly genuine devotion, the legend of the Morosini poisoner grew beyond recognition throughout Europe. Venice's propaganda machine, combined with popular imagination, had created something that bore no resemblance to the intelligent, desperate woman who turned kitchen knowledge into weapons of war. Stories spread through marketplaces, taverns, and noble courts, each retelling adding supernatural elements that made the truth even more impossible to recognize. She'd learned poison craft from demons. She could transform herself into smoke. She commanded armies of servant conspirators through witchcraft. She'd sold her soul for the power to topple aristocratic houses with nothing more than seasoned food. The manhunt continued for 2 more years, consuming Venetian resources and attention while chasing shadows that led nowhere. Investigators followed false sightings across half of Europe, tracking rumors and legends that bore no connection to the nun who spent her days copying religious texts in an Alsatian convent where no one remembered her worldly name. By 1724, the Republic officially declared the case closed, though reward notices remained posted throughout Italian territories for decades afterward. The Morosini Palazzo was eventually sold to the Grimani family, who had it blessed by 3 different priests before occupying rooms where 12 people had died drinking poisoned wine. The servant rebellion network that had terrified European nobility proved less enduring than its inspiration. Without Zara's systematic intelligence and careful planning, most conspirators were captured or fled to territories beyond aristocratic reach. A few successful poisonings occurred in scattered locations, but they lacked the precision and impact that had made the Morosini murders legendary. As for Sister Benedetta, she remained at Saint Odile until her natural death in 1758, 37 years after kneeling at those iron gates. The woman who'd been buried in the convent cemetery was remembered by her sisters as exceptionally devout, remarkably skilled at manuscript illumination, and possessed of an unusual knowledge of herbal medicine that proved invaluable during plague outbreaks. Her grave marker bore only the inscription, Sister Benedetta, Servant of God, with dates that encompassed a lifetime of apparent sanctity. No one mentioned that her medicinal knowledge extended to substances that could heal or harm depending on dosage, or that her steady hands had once measured death into wine goblets with the precision of a master alchemist. The convent's records showed that she'd confessed to unspecified sins of pride on her deathbed, receiving final absolution from a priest who understood that some secrets were better left with God. Whatever justice or injustice she dispensed in the world beyond monastery walls remained between her soul and the judgment that awaited all who crossed from time into eternity. But legends, like certain poisons, never entirely lose their potency. Even today, some say that on humid August nights, when the mist rolls across Venetian canals, you can smell something other than salt water and decay drifting from the shadows of abandoned palazzos. Something that carries the metallic tang of hemlock mixed with jasmine. The scent of revenge, served cold in crystal goblets that reflected candlelight like captured stars. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.